Hello, this is for our staff Pastor Parish Relations Committee training. And we're going to try it this way this year so that I can be at each of the churches and you can hear some of what is on our hearts as the cabinet and the bishop, and you can interact with that, talk to us some and back and forth so that we can do a better job at having you trained to do the work of the Staff Parish Relations Committee. It's a very important job. It's an administrative function, but it's also a leadership function in the local church. And because of that, we have got to remember to always focus on the mission of the local church, which is to make disciples for Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's the primary goal. The definition of the Staff Pastor Parish Relations Committee is the administrative unit in a local church where staff and congregational interests come together to focus on the mission of the church. So you see, the Staff Parish Relations Committee has both a leadership function and a management function. The leadership function is to have a vision, to keep the vision, the mission of the church always before us, as it relates to staff, but also as it relates to the parish. It's also to keep the parish focused on the mission with the staff. So it's not a matter of just managing the pastor and deciding who gets to be our pastor and who doesn't get to be our pastor. It's not a matter of only hiring staff. It's a matter of aligning the staff with the mission of the church, the mission of the United Methodist Church, but also the mission and vision of each local church. This is a very big responsibility, and it's important that we do this together and that we stay on the same page. And so that's why today we're going to try to come up with several things for you that will help you in this job because of its importance. The first thing I want you to look at is a handout called The Same Page, which literally is to keep you and me and the pastor all working together in the same types of ways. And so if you'll take a moment and get that handout, we'll let you look at it, and then we'll talk about those types of things. Now that you've had a chance to look at that handout, I want you to understand that, you see, the SPR is not a group to manage crises. It's a group to help us not have crises. It's a group to help build partnerships between a pastor, staff, and a local congregation for the mission of the church. That's what we're after. That's what we're going to do together. And so don't wait to have meetings when there's something wrong or needs to be addressed. Now, you certainly can have meetings when there are issues that need to be addressed. However, it's important that you work together throughout the year. And so one of the suggestions we have is that you should meet at least quarterly. Some churches meet every other month. Some churches meet monthly. It depends on your church and how best, but at least quarterly, where you're simply sitting down and having a talk with the pastor and the staff, for that matter, in a setting that doesn't have a problem right now. And if we do that, that hopefully will keep us out of problems and crises. And so there's a second handout that is called A Year with the PPR. And so if you will take a moment and look at that and just get a sense of the flow of the year, that will give you an idea of how best to manage throughout the year. Now, you don't have to stay to exactly every single one of these things. It's a guideline to help you get a sense of how the year flows by. So if you'll take a look at that second handout. One of the key functions of your committee is communication. And that is to have good communication with the pastor, but also with the entire congregation. So you stand in the middle in one sense, but I would prefer you to use the idea that you are a bridge, so that you're the one that helps people communicate. You're not necessarily doing the communication, you're helping that communication take place. And I think there are several things that help you in that. Number one, the communication that takes place in this particular committee stays in the room. It stays within the committee. If not, then you don't have a safe place for good conversations to take place. And so you need to covenant with each other that this is what we're going to do. I would encourage you not to take it home, that it stays within the committee, and that way your spouse doesn't have to have a part of this. It's not that you need to keep secrets, it's that we keep confidences. And there is a difference between being confidential and being secretive. And I think that confidential is that we can say things in love to each other and then not spread that out. Secretive becomes keeping information from people intentionally in a way that deceives. Confidences allow us to have a good relationship with each other. I can share my heart with you knowing that you're going to keep that between the two of us, or between us and the committee. Now, there are going to be times that people come to you and say, pour their heart out. And when you bring that to committee, you need to be able to say, this is who told me this. Jim Smith said this. Susan Jones said that. And this is her concern. This is his concern. Because if you don't, what you're going to end up with is some people feel this way. Some people think that. And it's not possible to work with that as a problem or as a situation, because you have no idea who you're talking about. You have no idea whether some people is 2 people or 100 people. And so we have to be specific. And you can say, well, wait a minute, then I break a confidence with that person. No, what you need to help that person understand is that your job is to take that message to the group. And so as long as that person, if the person says, well, I don't want my name mentioned, then what you need to say back is, well, then I'm sorry, I can't pass on that information. You will have to do that yourself. You will need to talk to the pastor. You will need to talk to the youth director, whatever the person we're talking about. You don't take the responsibility for passing on that information if we can't attach names to it. Because, like I say, it's impossible to deal with that situation. And that's not helpful at all. So always try to be very clear in communications. And see, like I say, if somebody comes and says, I'm going to say this to you in confidence and I don't want you to attach my name, you can listen and say, wow, that sounds like a real problem. I would suggest that you talk to the pastor about this. Or I'll be glad to pass that on, but you need to understand that I do it with your name. And if they say, oh, no, well, don't do that, then it becomes their responsibility to communicate, not yours. That's a very important thing, and it is key that you understand that this is how it works in this group, or else it doesn't work. It becomes an us and them kind of thing, and you have no idea who is on which side of those. And what we want to do is keep from having sides to begin with. We want good communication to take place in love. Now, the other thing is we have to be careful, because if we are not careful, then rumors can get started. And rumors will just kill us. To be honest, many churches struggle with this, and there becomes an undercurrent that's taking place, and we don't want that to happen. Because friends, to be honest, people out there that come to our church, they have enough stress and conflict in their lives without coming to church and finding more. And so if we're going to have conflicts, we need to deal with them in healthy, open ways. And that basically is your job. That's what you're to help take on, is that free communication going back and forth. Rumors get started because, well, so-and-so, I heard, and then suddenly it's going, when we're not checking the facts, we're not checking, is this exactly what happened? Let's discuss this. So-and-so told me this. I'd like to know what, I wasn't there that night, and I understand they weren't either, and so I'd like to know what happened. Those are conversations that are very helpful. Now, if we're going to be Southern and try to be nice all the time, that means that we can't be loving all the time. And so I would encourage you that let's try to exhibit the love of Jesus Christ and not try to be nice. Now you would say, well, I think Jesus was nice. Oh, I do too. I think Jesus was very nice. But my point is, sometimes we hold back because we say, well, I don't want to hurt their feelings. I don't want to stir up trouble, we say. Well, we need to talk about these kinds of things and have them on the table so that we're having open and honest conversations with each other. Now, to that, the group never meets without the pastor. The pastor is always present unless she or he excuses himself. But it's not for the group to ask the pastor to be excused. It is for the pastor to excuse herself or himself. We don't meet behind each other's backs. We meet together. And there are other ways to call a meeting. The chairperson can call a meeting in consultation with the pastor. The pastor can ask to have a meeting with the group. The superintendent can ask to have a meeting with the group and the pastor. And the bishop can initiate that meeting as well. All of these are ways that we get together and that we talk about the things that are important in congregations and important in our hearts. But the bottom line is the conversations we have are always centered in the mission of the church. They are always grounded in making disciples for Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's where every discussion begins and ends. And that's key to keep focused on what we're to do together in this committee. Now, there are several things that we do to support the clergy and the staff, all the staff. If you are at a congregation that has staff, now let's understand who staff is. You may say, well, we don't have any staff. We just have a piano player and a choir director, and they volunteer. Well, friends, they're volunteer staff. And so you need to treat them as staff. And that means you need to include them in certain discussions throughout the year. And that honors their position as volunteer staff. But many of you have people who are paid as the piano player, the choir director, the organist, whatever. Those are all staff. And you say, well, that's just part-time. I understand all that. But it's still your responsibility as the PPR to do this, to do this work with the whole staff. One thing is you need to be having conversations with them all the time. I would suggest that if you have 3 people on your staff, if you have 2, it doesn't matter, but however many, that you designate one person of the committee to be an advocate, to be in closer conversation with each staff person. So that Jim here is going to relate to the choir director. Susan there is going to relate to the piano player. So that there's just someone who's checking in, saying, hey, how are things going? I'm just wanting to make sure we're about to have a meeting, and I just want to check and see how things are going with you. That way, it also gives them a person that they can call and say, hey, I'd like to sit down and talk about some concerns I have. You see, so that's one practice, is simply designate specific people. Say, well, we don't mind, all of us don't mind listening. I understand that, but sometimes it's just easier to have a specific person, and that is helpful. You all are the ones that make recommendations for salaries, for compensation. You also are the ones who do things like have staff appreciation day, or a gift at Christmas, or a bonus at the end of the year, or whatever those ways you find to thank people. And yes, you may be paying them, but it's still important to say thank you. if you're not paying them, it's really important to say thank you. And so you need to figure out ways to do that, but it's your responsibility to do that. If you're going to give a bonus, you may have to talk to the finance committee and the treasurer and work that out, but it's not up to the treasurer to write that check until you all have made a decision about how you want to do that type of thing. Another part of supporting your pastor and staff is we need people to grow and to learn. And so we need them to have continuing education. Pastors are required to have continuing education every year. And so you need to make sure that that's taking place. You need to talk about that. But you see, as you talk, you can give ideas about where you think the pastor might benefit from some continuing education. But also the pastor can say, well, I'd really like to work in this particular area, this particular field. Same thing with your choir directors, your music people, youth, whatever that person is doing. You need to help them connect with things that are going on in the district and the conference. There are things in the denomination. There are things between denominations that are just wonderful. But you need to make sure that that happens and encourage your staff, both volunteer and paid, to do those kinds of things that brings new ideas, that brings refreshing, that brings renewal to them so that they can better work and lead in your congregation. Another thing is that you need to pay attention, especially with clergy, you need to pay attention to housing. Now that means that some of you have parsonages, some of you have housing allowance. Those of you that have parsonages, again, it is your responsibility to work with the trustees. Some churches have an actual parsonage committee. Whatever the structure is in your church, it's your responsibility to work with that group to make sure that there is good housing for the pastor. And that means that, that it's adequate for that pastor's family, but also that the house is in good repair and stays that way. Now, the pastor has a role in this as well. There needs to be communication, like I said earlier, across the bridge going both ways. And so there needs to be at least an annual walk through the house. This is not an inspection. This is an idea that issues, well, we've got a leaky roof over here and it's causing this issue. We've got this problem underneath the floor over here, it's causing this issue. So that more than just the pastor's family is having to deal with this. And this is important. We need you to pay attention here and to be working with pastors about parsonages. Now, pastors, you need to be working as well, and you can't just try to fix everything yourself. It's wonderful that you do that, but it's important that if you're going to fix something yourself, you let somebody else know you've done it, so that way we've always got a back and forth about housing. If there are issues that the trustees need to address, that's fine. Involve everybody in the discussion, but the responsibility for the parsonage is not the trustees, it's you. It's to make sure that you're walking through, that you're talking, that you're having these kinds of conversations about the house. Because the pastor is only living there temporarily, then there's going to be another pastor at some point in the future, and it's your responsibility to make sure that you protect your investment, if anything, if you want to see it that way. And it's not because pastors are neglecting things, it's just that a roof needs to be repaired every now and then. It needs to be re-roofed or whatever that is, and whatever the issue is. I served at a place and the roof started leaking terribly during a storm. We got the Pastoral Parish Relations Committee and the trustees together, and they said, well, you know, we just roofed that house. And I said, well, when did that happen? Well, when we actually talked through it, they realized that just roofing it was 28 years ago. And so they all kind of laughed and said, well, we got our money out of that roof. Well, I guess it's about time we put another one on. But see, without that discussion, one person would have said, well, we just roofed that thing. And everybody else would have gone, yeah. When we actually looked at what the history of it was, yeah, it was just that we all have good memories. So again, just pay attention That's part of what takes place here. Also, I hope you will pay attention to the working conditions of all of your staff. Sometimes we have to stick staff in rooms that we've got left over and let them have a little office or something, but I hope you will pay attention to those working conditions, both physically but also emotionally. You see, sometimes we put people under pressure. I think about some churches that have back-to-back worship services where one group leaves and the next group comes right in behind them. That's part of the working conditions. You just need to think through that. How do we support the staff? How do we help them catch a breath and be able to do their work better? Some of you have pastors who drive from one church to the next to the next. And so again, pay attention, see how you can best take care of the pastor in that drive on the morning. You don't want them rushing and being in an accident. I think of one congregation in our district that, you know, the train schedule sometimes determines when the pastor arrives. And so you just have to be open to that, talk about those things, because there's an emotional, a mental pull, as well as a thing about the physical nature of what we do. Now, what we're going to talk about for a few minutes is how we help pastors and each other do the work that we want to do together. And so sometimes we often think of this as the only function of the PPR, and that is to assess the pastor, how this pastor is doing, how she does with certain things. And so I have two handouts for you. You can look at them. One is a self-assessment that the pastor does himself. And then the other is one that the committee does with the pastor. Now, the two that I'm giving you are only suggestions. There are plenty of other possibilities out there. There are things that you all can do yourself. I just am telling you that it's important that you have these conversations. Now, it's important also for a pastor to understand what the church's expectations are. And so it's important to have these discussions before assessment is done instead of during assessments. And so this is a great conversation to have in a non-assessment time of the year when you're saying, okay, these are the things that we hope you as our pastor will do. But it becomes a discussion at this point. And let me give you several examples. It's important to have a discussion about a pastor's vacation. But also, what are your expectations when a pastor goes on vacation? How are pastoral emergencies handled while the pastor and her family, his family, are gone? And if you have those discussions when there's not an emergency, it's much better than waiting until somebody's 400 miles away at the beach with their family that they've paid for a week's vacation at a condo on the beach, and then suddenly there's a death and there's a crisis. You see, it's important to just go ahead and have that discussion ahead of time. And again, that goes back to expectations. Here's what we really expect. Here's what we would like to have happen. And as long as we're clear and everybody understands, then you can work that out when it's not a crisis instead of something that does come up as a crisis. So it's helpful to go through and say, okay, we'd really like you to do this, 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 and this. These are the things that are important. Now, this is especially true in churches with part-time pastors, where you need to walk through exactly what it is that you're thinking. But also, I would encourage you to assign a time with it. So in other words, to say, well, we expect our pastor to preach good sermons. Well, I would ask you, okay, well, how long does it take to prepare a good sermon? And you as the committee need to understand that and talk through that with the pastor, so that it's not just that hour on Sunday morning. You have to understand that Sunday morning begins much earlier with often the pastor's the one that unlocks the building or turns the heat on or whatever that is. But again, you've got to talk through those expectations and understand so that you have a clear understanding of what it is the pastor's doing. Now, to that also, what I would encourage the pastor to do is to keep a daily log of everything that's going on. I keep phone calls in my daily log, as well as visits I make or visits that people make to me at the office, or where I preach and how often I preach, how many sermons I prepare, hospital visits. Those are all things that I try to keep track of just in a daily way. Now, I don't write a whole book about it every day. I just simply keep a little list. But then I would encourage pastors to summarize that list and say to a committee monthly, every other month, quarterly, this is how many visits I've made in the last quarter. This is how many times I've preached. This is how many Bible studies I've taught. This is so that, again, you're being proactive. You're sharing information instead of requiring information. That the committee's saying, well, what is it you're doing? With the pastor saying, here's what I'm involved in right now. Here's what I've done with continuing education. Here's what I'm doing with my family. So that it's being shared both ways. And I would encourage you to keep track of that, pastors, so that you know exactly how you are spending your time. But don't spend a lot of time tracking it. Simply come up with a quick, easy, efficient method. Like I usually do at the end of the day, make a list of all that's happened that day. Sometimes I have to pay attention during the day because I'll forget by supper. But do that, and if you share those things, then assessment becomes a very different issue because you've been doing it, you've been sharing this information all year long. And so the assessment is, okay, well, how are we doing in this area? How are we doing in that area? And that is an important part of it. Now, I think assessment is not attached to the appointment. And then that's another role that you have. Okay, now we want to talk about the work that you as a committee, the pastor, and the superintendent do together. And this is where we talk about, all right, what is the appointment for this particular church? Now, there is assessment that goes in that. But if you've been doing it all year, then that's not a difficult thing. There are no surprises at this point. There are moments that pastors say, you know, I think I've done as much as I can do for this particular situation, and it's time for me to move on. There are other times where a local church will say, you know, we appreciate your ministry. You've done so many things for us, but we think that a change will help us move to another step, another place in our ministry in the community. And we'd like to have these particular talents or these particular things that a person can do that would help us move to that next step. Sometimes it's the superintendent that calls and says, I'd like us to talk about the work that we're doing here and perhaps consider a change. So all three groups, people, have a role in that, and again, we have conversations. Now, the way we do it in our conference is that we make the assumption that people are going to stay at least 5 years. And now you know as well as I do that we only make appointments 1 year at a time, but the assumption we have is that we're going to try to be there at least 5 years because it takes time to come to know a congregation. It takes time for a congregation to come to know a pastor. For leadership to be effective, it takes some years. And so that's our assumption. So we don't ask in those first 5 years, well, what do you think? What we ask is, are there any major issues that we need to talk about? And then we can sit down and talk about those, the superintendent with the pastor and the committee. After the 5-year mark, we do begin asking that question, okay, where are you this year in regards to the appointment of the person that you have now? Again, it's important that we are open and honest with each other. What we do not do is the pastor does not come to the superintendent and say, you got to get me out of this place, and then go back to the committee and say to the committee, well, I'll go wherever they send me, and I'd really love to stay, but the bishop and the cabinet want me to move. We don't do that. We say things to each other in love, but we also are honest. The same thing with the committee. The committee doesn't come to the superintendent and say, we've got to have a change, and then go back and say to the pastor, we just love you and we just hope they'll leave you one more year. Because, friends, I know you've never done it, but it's happened out there, and we just need to make sure we don't do that, that we talk to each other, that we have good conversations. Now, if you think that's a conversation that's too difficult for you to have with each other, that's when you get to involve the superintendent or others. And so we can help that conversation take place. But that is an important part of what we do. Now, inevitably, there's going to be a change. It may not be this year, it may not be next year, but at some point in our system, there is going to be a pastoral change. And again, it's up to you to make sure that that pastoral change goes well. It's important when a pastor leaves to thank her, to thank him for the ministry that person has provided. It's important to say thank you. It's important to say goodbye well. Because if you say goodbye well, then that means that there can be a good hello to the next person. If there are lingering things and problems that came up and it didn't end well before, then that next person walks into that, and it's difficult. So it's important to say goodbye well. And we have suggestions on that every year when there is a change projected. We have information that we give to you as a committee to say, here are some things that you ought to pay attention to in this transition. But this isn't a transition training today. This is an overall training. So there are other materials that we give you to help you in that transition moment. Now, we talked about staff. It's important that you understand that part of your role is as the personnel committee, the human resources, the HR group of the church. Every church, no matter how small you are, should have a personnel manual of some type. Now, it may be one piece of paper that simply goes through personnel kinds of things that are a part of this church. We all have safe sanctuary, and so that applies to staff as well as volunteers. But you need to consider, what are our personnel policies here? What are our policies on vacation? What are our policies on sick days? What are all of that? And you probably have people in your church very often. There are people who work in HR and in business and industry that have things. We have suggestions that we can also give you if that's something that you seek. But just understand that that's part of your role. That's part of the management role that you have. You have a leadership role and a management role, and that's one of those things that you've got to do, is to have the personnel policies in place for your church. All right, now let's talk about salaries for a moment. It is your responsibility to set the salary in that you make a recommendation. Not just salary, compensation, we should say, because it involves salary, it involves sometimes a housing allowance, it involves reimbursables, it involves continuing education, annual conference expense. All of those go into compensation. And it's your responsibility to recommend that to your finance committee, if you have a finance committee, and then on to your church council. Now, here's the key though. That group sets, the church conference actually sets it all, but it's your responsibility to negotiate and to have that happen. So let's say you say, we're going to set $10,000 as the salary for our part-time pastor. And it goes to finance, and finance says, well, you know, I don't think we can do that. We're going to have to do $9,500. It then comes back to you, and you have a discussion with finance to work that out. Finance doesn't get to just change the recommendations you're making. It has to be a discussion that takes place, and you all have to agree on that. Now, of course, the end of that, it goes to the church conference, and that's the final word, and that's what actually sets all the compensation. But it's important that you do this in conversation with each other. Again, it goes back to the bridge. you've got to kind of keep going back and forth, back and forth. It's not just, well, this is our responsibility and not yours. It falls in several different things when it comes to the church budget. All right, now let's talk about the organization of the group. You can look at the discipline. There are things that are there that specifically talk about. We can have as few as 5 people and as many as 9 that are actually members of the committee, but also the lay leader of the church and the lay member to annual conference are a part of this group. There's some difficulty in smaller churches because it says that we cannot have somebody, first of all, we can't have more than 1 family member on the committee. So you can't have a husband and wife, a parent and a child, sometimes an extended family. We have to use the definition of family a little more loosely in a smaller church, because I know we've got cousins that are related to us, but we're talking about more of the immediate family, that you don't have 2 of immediate family on there. Now you say, yeah, but my wife is the lay member to annual conference. Does that mean I can't serve on this? Well, it would be best to avoid that. But again, smaller churches have a smaller group of people to draw from. I would encourage you that if you can't do that, then you can't keep in those lines, that go to a smaller group. See, we can have as few as 5. So you don't necessarily have to have the 9 sitting there. It is important to be on panels that rotate because, friends, basically this is a hard job. And we ought to rotate this responsibility, and people ought to have their turn doing this for their church. So it's not so much to keep you from doing it, it's just that it's a hard job and we want to make sure we rotate. And so most churches have panels in a 3-year, so if you have 9, you have 3 people on each panel, and that way you can serve 2 consecutive terms, and then you have to be off according to the discipline, and then you can come back on after a break. So it's very important that you pay attention to those kind of things because it divides the responsibility. It also helps other members of the church know what it is that goes on and how that takes place. And so it's important that you do that. All right, another role that we have as the staff parish is that we have a responsibility to help candidates for ministry discern their call. A person comes to a superintendent and says, I'm hearing God's call in my life to be in ministry. We have a candidacy process, but one part of that process is that you, as the staff parish, as a pastor parish committee, you have to approve that person's candidacy. Now, friends, this is an important task, but it is also a difficult task because where you sit, you're sitting with this person that you have helped raise in some cases. You are sitting in a room talking to a person whose great-grandparents helped found this church or whose grandmother was your Sunday school teacher. These are people that you know and know intimately. And so sometimes it's difficult to help that person. But what your job is not to approve or disapprove. It's to help them discern, to help them understand what God's call is in their life. And so you of all people get to see this person's gifts and graces much more than anybody else because you are more closely connected with this person. And so you need to help that person hear God's call. Now there's some cases where you need to help, and it's not just young people, anybody. You need to help someone and say, have you considered God's call in your life? Have you considered the ministry? Sometimes that's your role. Sometimes your role is to say, what type of ministry do you think God's calling? Is it a work with children, with youth? Is it to work with older adults? Is it to be a chaplain in the military? You see, there's so many different ways that we are in ministry. It's not just the pastor of a local church. And so, see, you can help a person better hear that by saying, well, you know, I've noticed the gifts that you have are musical. And so perhaps you want to be a minister of music. I've noticed your gifts with children are extraordinary. You see, you get to help direct that person. So it's not a matter of, well, do we approve this person or not? The bottom line, though, is if you are going to approve this person, the question you need to ask yourselves is this someone we will accept as our pastor here? Does this person have the gifts and graces to be our pastor? Because we, at the district and at the conference level, depend upon local churches to be honest about this and to tell us. Now, like I say, it's a difficult position to sit in. It's very hard to say to someone, you know, I'm just not sure you're ready yet. And perhaps you should do a little more work before you go on in this process. That's a hard thing to say. But sometimes we've had to say it at the district level and even at the conference level, where we say to a person, we think God is calling you to ministry. We just don't understand that God's calling you to be the pastor of a local church. And so we try, in that case, to help a person hear that call more clearly so that they can be in ministry. Now, to be honest, the discipline, and we say the scriptures say that we're all ministers. And so that's another part of it, is that we all have to consider what our ministries are. You are on the staff Parish Relations Committee, the pastor Parish Relations Committee, depends on what your church calls it. That is a ministry in itself. It is a difficult ministry. It's an important ministry. And as I hope you've heard over this last few minutes, it's a critical ministry. Yeah. There's several other things I just want to call your attention to. We have lots of resources in the district office if you want to take advantage of those. There is a guidelines book that the United Methodist Church puts out every quadrennia, and so we've got one of those for you. And so you can borrow those, we can purchase those for you. So use those as well. The discipline is always a resource that we draw on. There are times that you have questions, and you're more than welcome to call me as the superintendent and work through those questions. We've done this differently where we haven't been all together in one place, that we've tried to make it easier on you and have this, but that also means that you can't ask questions in this particular moment, but that doesn't mean you can't ask questions. So please call, email, those are the kinds of things as you do, and I'll be glad to work with you. Again, what we're trying to do is to work with people, which sometimes is difficult. But the reason we work with people is to make disciples for Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Our job is to help the ministry of local churches be effective in this time and in this place. And there are a couple of other things that I have for you. One is called the wheel of the PPR, SPPR witness. And it just has 12 sections on it of the things that you can do and you can rate yourself as a committee. So we talk about assessing the pastor, but you need to assess how well are we doing our work. And then the thing that I hope you will also look at is how to lead from the pew, working with the pastor. And there are a number of things on this that say, but here's some of it's what it says. It says, we are a people of prayer. We ground ourselves in the essential stories of the Christian faith. We live in the context of God's grace. We value the pastor's ministry to strengthen his sense of call and fruitfulness in ministry. And so I hope you'll look at that as well, of just the ways that we can work from the pew with each other. Friends, the bottom line of everything that I've said to you is communication. If you're talking to each other, if you're working through issues, if you're being clear, what expectations are and the types of things that are going on in people's lives. If a pastor is clear with what is going on in her life and his life, sometimes you need to be very clear, pastors, about what's going on with your own health, what's going on in your family's life. It's important to share those kinds of things, and this can take place in the security of a staff parish relations committee that is committed in love to each other, but to Jesus Christ. We are working to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's primary. This committee is not to manage the pastor. It's not to manage the staff. This committee's job is to make disciples for Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world by relating to the pastor, to the staff, and to the rest of the congregation. I thank you for being willing to serve on this committee. It is difficult. It's a hard place to be, standing out there on that bridge, being that bridge at times. It is very difficult. I'm convinced that there's a special place in heaven for people who have served on this particular committee because it's just a hard thing to do. And so I appreciate that you've made the commitment to do it, and look forward to working with you as we work together in the ministry at your church, but also as we work together as United Methodist Christians. Thank you.